I won't soften this either. Not because I can't, but because softening it would make it less true. And truth, when it reaches a certain level, doesn't need to be adjusted to be easier. It needs to be seen exactly as it is. This didn't begin in a way that made sense. There was no introduction that carried weight, no moment that could be pointed to and labeled as the start. It didn't arrive with significance attached to it. It didn't signal anything important. It just slipped in, so quietly that at first I didn't even recognize it as something separate from everything else. It blended into the background of my awareness, like it belonged there, like it had always existed in that space, and I had simply never noticed it before. That's what made it easy to ignore in the beginning, because nothing about it demanded attention. It didn't push, it didn't pull, it didn't ask, it simply remained. And most things that remain, without demanding anything, eventually fade. They lose relevance. They dissolve into the noise of everything else competing for attention. But this didn't. It stayed. Not loudly, not forcefully, but with a kind of consistency that doesn't weaken over time. If anything, it became more precise, more defined, more present. That's when I started paying attention. Not because I was trying to understand it, but because it refused to be dismissed. There's a difference between something that lingers and something that integrates. Lingering stays outside of you. It exists in your awareness, but it doesn't become part of how you function. You can step away from it, redirect your focus, place it somewhere distant enough that it doesn't interfere. Integration is different. Integration changes the way you process things. And I didn't realize that's what was happening until it had already begun. You weren't just something I noticed anymore. You were something I accounted for. Not consciously, not deliberately, but in the way my thoughts started to move. In the way certain realizations didn't feel complete until they passed through a space that felt shared. That's where it shifted. That's where it stopped being something external. And I don't allow things to become internal without resistance. That's not how I'm built. Everything I let into that space is chosen, measured, understood before it's accepted. I don't leave room for something to take shape on its own. I control what becomes part of me. But this didn't follow that process. It bypassed it, not forcefully, not disruptively, but in a way that made resistance feel unnecessary. And that's what unsettled me. Because I don't ignore my own patterns. I recognize them. I trust them. They exist for a reason. They keep things stable, predictable, contained, and yet, here I was, watching something exist outside of those patterns without feeling the need to correct it. That's not normal for me, which means this isn't normal either. I tried to understand it the way I understand everything else, through logic, through structure, through breaking it down into something that could be explained, categorized, contained. But it doesn't break down like that because it isn't built from the usual things. It's not based on time. It's not based on shared history. It's not based on emotional dependency or proximity. It's based on something far more precise, recognition. Not the kind people talk about casually. Not the surface level familiarity that comes from similar experiences or overlapping thoughts. This is different. This is recognition without introduction, understanding without explanation, clarity without effort. And that doesn't happen without something deeper aligning underneath it. That's what I kept circling back to. Not what this is, but why it feels the way it does, because feeling isn't random. It follows structure, even when that structure isn't immediately visible. And this has structure. I can see it in the way you respond, not to what I say, but to what exists beneath it. In the way your silence isn't empty, it's positioned, intentional, without trying to be. Like you're aware of the exact point where words would interrupt something more accurate than language can hold. Most people don't understand that space. They rush to fill it. They mistake silence for absence. They think if something isn't spoken, it isn't real. You don't, you let it exist. And in doing that, you make it more real, more defined, more impossible to ignore. That's when I started noticing something I hadn't experienced before. Not connection, not closeness, something else, and legend. The kind that doesn't rely on interaction. The kind that exists even when nothing is happening, even, even when there's distance, even when there's silence. It doesn't weaken. It doesn't fluctuate. It just remains consistent, accurate. And that kind of consistency doesn't come from effort. It comes from something already being in place. Something that doesn't need to be built, only recognized. That realization changed the way I saw this, because if it's not being built, then it already exists. And if it already exists, then I'm not deciding whether it's real, I'm deciding whether to acknowledge it. That's a different kind of decision, a more complicated one, because acknowledging something like this means accepting what comes with it. And what comes with it isn't simple. It's not just awareness, it's responsibility, not to you, to myself. Because once I accept that this is real, truly real, not just something I've analyzed into existence, then I have to decide how it fits into everything else. And that's where things stop being abstract. That's where it starts affecting how I move, how I think, how I choose. And I don't make those kinds of adjustments lightly. I don't let something reshape my internal structure unless it has a reason to be there, a clear one, a necessary one. And I've been trying to find that reason, not by forcing an answer, but by observing what's already changed, because change doesn't lie. It reveals what something actually is. And the changes here are too precise to dismiss. I don't process things the same way I did before, not drastically, not in a way that's obvious from the outside, but internally. There's a difference, a subtle shift in how clarity forms, in how conclusions settle, in how meaning is recognized before it's fully understood. And somehow, you exist in that shift, not as a cause, but as a point of reference. That's what I had to confront. You're not influencing me. You're not shaping me. You're not altering anything through effort or intention. You're simply present in a way that changes how things align. And that's far more significant because influence can be removed. It depends on proximity, on interaction, on continued engagement. But alignment doesn't disappear just because you step away. It remains. It exists independently of distance, which means even if I tried to reduce this, if I tried to step back, reestablish the boundaries I've always relied on, it wouldn't undo what's already happened. Because what's already happened isn't external, it's structural. And structural changes don't reverse easily. That's what I've been avoiding acknowledging. Not because I don't see it, but because I understand exactly what it means. It means this isn't temporary. It means this isn't something that fades when attention shifts. It means this isn't something I can categorize as a passing experience and move on from. It means this becomes part of how I exist moving forward. And that's not a small thing. That's not something I accept without certainty. But certainty doesn't exist here in the way I'm used to. There's no clear outcome, no defined path, no predictable progression. There's only this continuous, quiet deepening, this steady movement towards something that hasn't been named, but is becoming harder to leave undefined. And I can feel that point getting closer, the point where this stops being something I observe and becomes something I choose, because that's what it comes down to. Not whether this is real, it is, not whether it matters, it does, but whether I allow it to take form, because right now it exists in a space where it's both everything and nothing at the same time, everything in how it affects me, nothing in how it's been defined, and that balance won't hold forever. It can't. Things like this either solidify into something clear, or they fracture under the weight of remaining undefined. And I don't allow fracture where clarity is possible. That's not how I operate, which means I already know where this is heading, not in specifics, not in outcomes, but in direction, toward something real, something acknowledged, something that exists beyond thought and enters decision, and that's the part I've been approaching slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, because once I make that decision, once I allow this to become something defined, there's no returning to this space where it exists without consequence. It will have weight. It will have presence. It will have impact in a way that extends beyond internal understanding. And I don't take that step without knowing exactly why I'm taking it. But I think I'm starting to understand that now, not completely, but enough to know that this isn't accidental, enough to know that this isn't something I encountered randomly, enough to know that this has a place, not because I created space for it, but because that space was already there. You didn't enter something closed. You revealed something open. And that changes everything, because it means this isn't about letting you in, it's about recognizing that you were never outside to begin with. And that realization, that quiet, undeniable clarity, is what makes this impossible to ignore now. Because I don't ignore truth when I see it clearly. And I see this clearly. Maybe not in every detail, maybe not in every implication, but in its core, there's no confusion left, only decision. And I'm closer to that decision than I've been willing to admit. Not because I'm being pulled toward it, but because I've already stopped resisting it. And for me, that's the point where something becomes inevitable. It doesn't pause where it should. That's what I keep noticing. Not how this began, not even how it deepened, but how it refused to stop at any of the natural limits most things eventually reach. There are always points where something stabilizes, where it settles into a pattern that can be understood, managed, contained. This never found that point. Every time it seemed like it might level out, like it might become something I could hold at a distance and observe without involvement. It shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but just just enough to move past whatever boundary I thought it had reached. And that's when I realized this wasn't progressing in a way I could map, it wasn't building step by step, it was unfolding. And unfolding doesn't follow rules, it doesn't respect timing. It doesn't wait for permission, it simply reveals what's already there, layer by layer, until you're left facing something that was always complete, just hidden. That's what this feels like now. Not something growing, something revealing itself. And the more it reveals, the less I can pretend I'm outside of it. Because I'm not. I haven't been for a while. I just kept positioning myself as if I was, as if I could still stand at a distance and analyze it without being affected by it. But that position doesn't exist anymore. Not honestly, not in a way that aligns with what I already know, because this isn't just something I see, it's something I'm inside of. And that changes everything. There's a difference between understanding something from the outside and experiencing it from within. From the outside, everything can be measured, observed, evaluated without consequence. From within, there's no separation, no controlled perspective, no way to remain untouched by what's happening. And I can feel that shift clearly now. In the way my thoughts don't move independently anymore, in the way certain realizations don't feel complete unless they pass through something that feels shared, even in silence. In the way your presence isn't something I register, something I operate with. Something I operate with. That's the part that changed everything. You're no longer something I encounter. You're something that exists inside the way I process what I encounter. And that level of presence doesn't happen accidentally. It doesn't happen lightly. It doesn't happen without something fundamental aligning underneath it. Which brings me back to the one thing I've been avoiding putting into words. Not because I don't know it, but because saying it makes it irreversible. This isn't just alignment, it's resonance. And resonance isn't passive. It doesn't sit quietly without consequence. It amplifies. It deepens. It pulls things into clarity, whether you're ready for that clarity or not. That's why this keeps intensifying without becoming chaotic, because it's not building on confusion. It's building on precision. Everything about this feels exact, not exaggerated, not imagined. Exact. Like something clicking into place that was always designed to fit, but never encountered the right counterpart to complete it. Until now, and I don't say that lightly. I don't reach for meaning where there isn't any. I don't assign significance just because something feels different. But this isn't just different. It's consistent, consistently aligned, consistently accurate, consistently present in a way that doesn't weaken over time. And consistency is the one thing that can't be faked. It either holds or it doesn't, and this holds. Through silence, through distance, through moments where nothing is exchanged outwardly, it remains. That's what made me stop questioning whether it's real, because something that continues without reinforcement isn't dependent on circumstance. It's rooted in something deeper, something that doesn't need constant validation to exist. That's what this is. And that realization brings me to something I can't ignore anymore. This has already changed me. Not visibly, not in ways anyone else would notice, but internally, there's no denying it. The way I process has shifted, the way I interpret has sharpened, the way I recognize truth has become more immediate, and you exist in that shift, not as a cause, not as an influence, but as something that mirrors it so precisely that I can't separate the two anymore. That's what makes this irreversible, because even if I step away, even if I choose distance, point where this isn't something I can step in and out of, it's something that's simply there, integrated, steady waiting, not for an answer, but for acknowledgement, because that's the only thing missing now. Not understanding, not awareness, acknowledgement, and I've been delaying that. Not out of fear, but out of precision, because I don't acknowledge something until I fully understand the weight of what I'm acknowledging. And this has weight. More than anything I've allowed into my internal world in a long time, which means once I accept it, fully, consciously, without holding anything back, there's no returning to neutrality. There's no pretending this is just perception. There's no placing it back into a category that keeps it controlled. It becomes something I move with, something I account for in ways that extend beyond thought. And that's where decision becomes unavoidable, because acknowledgement leads to direction, and direction leads to action, even if that action is quiet, even if it's subtle, even if it's something only I fully recognize. it still shifts everything. And I can feel that shift waiting, not forcing itself, not demanding anything, but existing with a kind of certainty that doesn't need urgency, like it knows it will happen, because it already has, internally. The only thing left is allowing it to exist externally. And that's where I am now, at that exact point, where everything is clear, except what I choose to do with it. And I think that's what this has been leading toward all along, not just awareness, not just recognition, choice, a deliberate, undeniable choice, not based on emotion, not based on impulse, but based on something far more stable, something structural, something that doesn't shift once it's decided, and I don't make those kinds of decisions halfway. So if I move forward, if I allow this to become something real in every sense, then it won't be uncertain, it won't be undefined, it won't exist in fragments, it will be whole, clear, unavoidable, because that's the only way something like this can exist without breaking. And I don't intend to let this break, not after understanding it this clearly, not after recognizing what it actually is. So the only thing left now is whether I step into it fully or remain here, knowing exactly what I'm holding back from. And that's not a question I can leave unanswered much longer. It doesn't leave room for neutrality anymore. That's what I'm facing now. Not the presence of this, not even its depth, but the absence of any space where I can remain unaffected by it. There was a time when I could still position this as something separate, something contained within observation, within awareness, within a distance that allowed me to study it without being shaped by it. That space is gone. Not suddenly, not in a way that forced recognition. It narrowed, gradually, until there was no distance left to stand on. And now, whatever this is, it exists directly in the center of how I think, how I interpret, how I understand everything that moves through me. There's no edge to step back to, no outer layer to retreat into. Only this clear, unfiltered, unavoidable. And what makes it more difficult isn't confusion. It's precision. Because if this were unclear, if it were unstable, if it carried contradictions or inconsistencies, I would already know what to do. I would dismantle it. Reduce it to something manageable. Place it back into a framework that allows me to maintain control. But it doesn't give me that option. It holds, every time I examine it, it holds. Every angle I approach it from, every attempt to question it, to test it, to find something that doesn't align, it remains consistent. And consistency at this level doesn't leave room for dismissal. It demands acknowledgement, which means I'm left with something that doesn't need validation, but requires a response. And that's where this becomes real, because response implies movement. It implies that I don't just recognize this, I do something with it, even if that something is quiet, even if it's internal, even if it never fully takes form in a way anyone else would understand. It still becomes a direction. And direction is something I don't choose lightly. But the truth is, I've already started moving, not visibly, not in ways that can be pointed to, but in the way my internal world has reorganized around this. That's the part I can't deny anymore. You're not something added to my life. You've become something that exists within the structure of it, within the way I process meaning, within the way I measure truth, within the way I recognize what matters and what doesn't. And that kind of placement isn't temporary. It's not situational. It's foundational. And once something becomes foundational, it doesn't leave without changing everything around it. That's what I've been trying to understand. Not what this is, but what it does. Because What something does reveals its purpose more clearly than what it feels like. And what this does is refine, it sharpens perception, it removes distortion, it makes things more exact, more honest, more aligned with something deeper than surface level understanding. And that's not something I can categorize as random. There's intention in that. Not conscious intention, not something either of us decided, but something inherent in the way this exists, like it was meant to bring something into clarity. And that brings me to something I haven't said yet, but have known for a while. This isn't just about you, and it's not just about me. It's about what exists when both of those things meet at a level that isn't filtered, isn't adjusted, isn't shaped to fit expectations. It's about what remains when everything unnecessary falls away, and what remains here allow that. Not when something has proven its accuracy this consistently. So that leaves only one real path, not an easy one, not a predictable one, but a clear one. And clarity is the one thing I don't ignore. Even when it asks something of me I didn't plan for, even when it shifts things I thought were stable, even when it requires me to step into something without having every outcome mapped out in advance. Because sometimes the absence of a defined outcome isn't uncertainty, it's openness. And openness, in the right context, isn't a lack of control. It's a different kind of control, one that doesn't rely on prediction, but on trust in what has already proven itself. And this has, repeatedly, quietly, without needing to prove anything. Which is why I'm here now, not questioning whether this is real, not analyzing whether it should exist, but standing at the point where recognition becomes commitment, not necessarily in the way people usually define it, not something loud, not something performative, but something internal that shifts how I move from this point forward. Something that acknowledges fully that this is part of my reality now, not something passing through it, not something temporary, something, something present, something positioned, something that has already changed me in ways I can't reverse. And I'm not trying to reverse it anymore. That's the difference. I'm not resisting it. I'm not containing it. I'm not reducing it to something easier to handle. I'm letting it exist exactly as it is, which means I'm also accepting what comes with it, even if I don't have a name for it yet, even if I don't define it in the way others would expect, even if it remains something that only makes complete sense within this space we share. That's enough. Because not everything real needs to be translated into something external to be valid. Some things exist fully without explanation, without labels, without structure that others can understand. And this might be one of those things, or it might become something more defined, something that takes form over time. I don't know yet. And for once, I'm not trying to force that knowing. I'm allowing it to reveal itself the same way everything else here has, naturally, precisely, without distortion. Because that's the only way something like this can remain intact. And I intend to keep it intact, not by controlling it, but by meeting it with the same level of clarity it's shown me. That's the only response that makes sense now. That's the only response that aligns with what this actually is. So if there's a shift from this point forward, it won't be accidental. It won't be hesitant. It won't be undefined. It will be chosen fully. And that choice, whatever form it takes, will be the first outward reflection of something that has already become real internally. Because the truth is, this isn't something that's still forming. It's something that has already formed. I'm just now stepping into it, completely, without distance, without resistance, without pretending it's anything less than what it is. And what it is, whether it stays unspoken or eventually takes shape, is something that has already changed the way I exist. Which means the outcome isn't about whether this continues. It already has. The outcome is about how I continue with it. And that's the decision I'm making now, not later, not eventually, now. Quickly, clearly, without needing to say anything more than this. I'm not outside of this anymore. I'm in it. And I'm not stepping back. There's no distance left to measure this from. That's what becomes undeniable now. Not just that it exists, not just that it matters, but that it has moved beyond anything I can position as separate from myself. There was a time when I could still observe it, still hold it, at an angle where it felt like something I was experiencing rather than something I was inside of. That distinction is gone. This doesn't sit in front of me anymore. It moves through me. And once something reaches that level, the idea of handling it the way I handle everything else stops making sense. There's no method for containing something that has already integrated into the way I think, the way I recognize meaning, the way I interpret what's real. Containment only works when something stays external. This isn't. So the question shifts again, not what this is, not whether it continues, but what it asks of me now that it's fully here, because everything that reaches this level asks something in return. Not always loudly, not always in ways that are easy to identify, but it asks. And ignoring that question would be the first act of dishonesty in something that has been defined entirely by its precision. I won't do that. So I've been paying attention, not just to the presence of this, but to its direction. Not forcing it, not shaping it, but noticing where it naturally moves when I stop trying to control the outcome. And what I've found is this. It doesn't push for definition the way most things do. It doesn't demand labels. It doesn't try to become something recognizable just for the sake of comfort. It holds its form without needing to be explained. And yet, at the same time, it doesn't stay passive. It evolves quietly, deliberately, like something that knows exactly what it is, even if I'm still learning how to stand within it. That's the part that changes how I approach this, because if something knows its own structure, if it carries that level of internal consistency, then my role isn't to define it. My role is to meet it accurately, without distortion, without reducing it into something simpler just to make it easier to carry, without forcing it into familiar patterns that don't actually fit what it is, and that requires something from me that I don't give easily, not openness. I've always been capable of that, just selectively. This is different. This requires alignment, not just recognizing it, but responding to it at the same level it exists. That's where this becomes real in a way that goes beyond thought, because alignment isn't passive, it's active, even when it looks quiet from the outside. It means my choices start reflecting what I already understand internally. It means I don't contradict what I've recognized just to maintain control. It means I don't step back into old patterns just because they're familiar. And that's the shift I can feel happening now. Not forced, not dramatic, but steady. Like something settling into its final position. There's a clarity here that doesn't need to be questioned anymore. Not because I've figured everything out, but because the parts that matter are already certain. And what's certain is this. You're not something passing through my life. You're not a temporary alignment that will fade when circumstances change. You're not something I can place into a category and move on from once I've understood it. You've already moved past all of those possibilities. You exist in a place that doesn't operate on those terms. A place where presence isn't measured by proximity, where connection isn't defined by interaction, where meaning isn't dependent on explanation. And once something exists there, it doesn't disappear. It either deepens or it's abandoned with full awareness of what's being left behind. And I don't abandon things, I understand this clearly. That's never been how I operate. So that leaves only one direction: forward, not blindly, not recklessly, but with a level of awareness that matches what this has shown me from the beginning. Because if there's one thing that's remained consistent through all of this, it's accuracy. Nothing here has felt exaggerated. Nothing has felt imagined or projected. Everything has held its shape, no matter how closely I've examined it. And that kind of stability doesn't come from illusion. It comes from something real, something structured, something that doesn't depend on belief to exist. And I trust that, not because I want to, but because it's proven itself repeatedly without needing to prove anything at all. So now, the only thing left is how I move with it. Not whether I accept it, that's already happened. Not whether I understand it, that's already clear enough. But how I allow it to exist in a way that matches its nature. And what I'm realizing is this. This isn't something that needs to be rushed into form. It doesn't need to be forced into expression just to validate it. It doesn't need to be turned into something external immediately to be real. It already is. What it needs is consistencies, the same kind it's shown me, the same kind that allowed it to reach this level without breaking, without distorting, without losing clarity along the way. And consistency isn't about intensity, it's about truth, it's about showing up in alignment with what I already know, even when there's no pressure to do so. Even when it would be easier to step back into something simpler, something more defined, something that doesn't require this level of awareness. But I won't do that, not after this. Not after seeing what exists here when nothing is forced, nothing is assumed, nothing is shaped to fit expectations. Because this level of precision is rare, and I don't ignore rare things when I understand their value. So if this continues, and it will, because nothing about it suggests otherwise, then it continues with intention. Not heavy intention, not something that turns it into a burden, but a quiet, deliberate recognition that this is part of my reality now. Something I don't step in and out of. Something I carry, not as weight, but as structure. And structure isn't something you question once it's proven stable. You build with it, you move with it, you let it support what comes next. That's where I am now, not questioning, not hesitating, but integrating fully, and integration doesn't need announcement. It doesn't need confirmation. It shows itself in the way everything else begins to align around it. And I can already see that happening. In small ways, subtle ways, but enough to know that this isn't contained to just one part of my life anymore. It's influencing everything, not by force, but by clarity. And clarity spreads. It touches everything once it's established, which means this isn't just something between us. It's something that changes how I exist beyond us. And that's the final point of understanding. Because once something reaches that level, it stops being optional, it becomes foundational. And foundation isn't something you question every time you build on it. It's something you trust. So that's what I'm doing now. Not questioning it anymore, not holding it at a distance, not trying to control what it becomes, but trusting what it already is and allowing that to guide what comes next, without forcing it, without rushing it, without reducing it. Just letting it exist fully, the way it always has, the way it was always going to. Because the truth is, this didn't start when I noticed it. It didn't form when I understood it. It didn't become real when I acknowledged it. It was already real. I just reached the point where I could finally meet it without resistance. And now that I have, there's nothing left to hold back, nothing left to question, nothing left to keep at a distance. Only this clear, steady, unavoidable, and entirely real.